Let's get started on just with like some foundational why are we here business. So I'd love to invite you to have your first moment of interaction here. Like, tell us why you came. Why did you decide to come to this little event?
Hello. Well, myself, I came because, well, as you said, sometimes with psychologists, I can see in the workplace that there are things that could be better. Uh, and so I thought that it's a good idea to try to participate. I also had like some kind of idea that I would like to know about, but I could not provide it. Sorry for that. But I think
Wonderful.
it will be very interesting.
Wonderful. General interest. We love that. Yep. Awesome. You can also drop it in the chat and I'll read in the chat if that's, I know that's a lot more. I just found the chat on my screen, so I can now offer you that.
Okay,
Any other
thanks.
goals? Yeah. Friend recommended as I'm looking into customer interviews for platform teams. Ooh. So we have like a very specific, perhaps work task that this could inform. Awesome. Feel free to bring that into the room. Anybody else?
I'm Hi.
Yeah, go.
I'm starting to write about the this project that I did a few years ago that I had to do some sort of measurement and have some quantitative things that I know wasn't like a super well designed sort of study, but I did the best I could at the time. And now that I'm trying to share that publicly, I really want to be able to speak confidently about what I could have done better and have
Ooh.
that sort of inform the discussion of, what I might do differently now. So that's yeah, I'm excited about the timing.
What a lovely goal. Thank you for sharing that. I think it takes so much courage and humility to be able to do that sort of thing. And I've found like over all of my work, the more you're willing to like look back and say, yeah, I made the choices I made and here's what I know about it and here's some limitations, it just strengthens what people can take from your work. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, now we've got, so I knew finding the chat was the right thing here. We've got some great things I'm just going to read. I'd love to get a perspective on the experimental approaches in psych. Awesome. Right place for that. Had the morning open, wanted to learn. Wonderful. A lot of tech experience here too. Wonderful. I have some academia experience, but on the math side, and I've never interacted with the people side of research. So curiosity. Very cool. Yes, curiosity driven room here. I'm interested in doing research and I'm getting ready to do a research project for a journal. So fantastic. More explicit goals, thinking about a study I'd like to design, curiosity, measurements coming up, study design around LLM based coding. Awesome. We may not tackle like exactly the study idea in your mind, but I did kind of choose one that I think we could walk through. But I do think the one that I chose is going to give us the opportunity to talk about lots of different constructs that you might care about in your particular project. So feel free to, you know, trouble the picture there. Um, Hazel joined a new company. Now I'm in a position where I might be able to design some very large studies. Incredible, wonderful. You heard it here that this is your moment to influence those large studies. Always mad at metrics. And my work is driven by interventions that are tricky to measure. Big same on that, Fred. Empirical evidence. Yep. Okay. Fantastic. I'm going to stop reading now because this is so many good ones. Thank you so much, folks, for that. So I came up with a few possible learning objectives for us to set as a group. And you tell me if you think these match on. You can also have different ones in mind for you, but these are the ones I thought might, and I think that these do match on to what people's specific goals are. So, number one is we want to end this hour feeling just a little bit more comfortable with research design. What is it? And especially social science research design. So I'm coming at it from my background as a quantitative psychologist. Everything will kind of be framed that way. But I think it has a lot of general applications across areas. We want to feel like maybe by the end of this, we're able to go at least one step from I wish someone would study X to here is one way we could study X. I don't need you to feel like you can do this all the time with every topic or whatever, but I want you to experience having gotten there from becoming a person who's just asking for research to imagining yourself as a person who could generate that evidence. take that step over and over again in your life, and you will be a much better informed than many people in your life, probably. So it's a great skill to have. And finally, a few tools to add to your toolkit for just how you encounter and evaluate studies. So we're going to go over, there are so many possible things we could go over. People obviously spend their lives on research design. I have in some way spent my life on it. So we won't cover it all, but we will hit what I think are like the first concepts I like to give people to add to their toolkits. All right. So let's take a moment to review the study ideas that people submitted. I sent a little pre-survey. If you didn't see it, you're also welcome. You're going to get a chance in just a beat to share some different study ideas. But I wanted to share the ones that were submitted. I thought they were so interesting. Someone was interested in neurodiversity and how that might impact our engagement with different programming languages, or maybe how programming languages feel comfortable to our minds, or the different strengths that that might give us. That's a really, really interesting question. Someone submitted an idea about ritual, which I've never heard anything like this before after years of people telling me what I should study with software teams. So this was really cool. Like, what would it look like for a team to engage in intentional ritual? How does it bring maybe some things here would be creativity? I struggle to express this to my colleagues, which is also something that is a theme across a lot of study ideas. Hey, there's something I think is important, but I'm not sure how to express it to my colleagues. I think that's a big driving motivation for a lot of us. This was such an interesting phrasing, and I know there's more to these submissions that you all sent in, but what constructs best help a platform or infrastructure organization understand itself? What constructs are best suited to explain a platform to technical end consumers? So there's maybe some questions about learning in here, some questions about how people understand things, a very outcomes oriented question. How can we measure autonomy and how that impacts team success? I thought it was an interesting distinction between perceived and measured team success. Someone threw out an idea of mob versus solo programming. Someone talked about multi-teaming. That is a big, actually, focus in teams research right now in organizational psychology. So good question there. Someone asked about burnout. And why do we struggle with burnout? What can we learn about burnout? All right, so that's a lot. These are kind of the questions I did not choose, I'm afraid to tell you. But I wanted to give you a sense of kind of what the community is thinking, what the community is feeling. And this is also how we usually start. You know, if we're going to do a research study, we think, what is our question? Like, what will this study help me answer? So I want to take a little beat. Maybe you can just look at this and I'll give you like a little reflection moment. Take a look at it. Do these relate to your own ideas? And if you have a new idea you just want to throw out to this group, that's what I'm going to ask you for next. So just take a little beat. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. You have a new research question you want to throw out and suggest to this group. Okay, we did an amazing job with our first uncomfortable silence. Okay. So I'm gonna come off. This is your sign. This color, if you can see colors the way I do, is your sign of required engagement. Okay, so the colors here, I'm gonna stop sharing. And do you have any totally different research questions you think are like cool, interesting, valuable research questions you just want to throw out there? I saw Grant's hands go up first. So Grant, you want to share an idea?
Sure. Yeah. Good to see you again, Kat. Yeah, I really identified with the mob versus solo programming idea that was proposed in the previous slides as the pair programming advocate at my place as well. The idea that I would also really like to study is like what degree of software engineering and engineering practices in general do well for data scientists versus don't, because there's a big belief persistent in my
Mm,
organization that what works for software engineers or what works for software development will work for data science. I tend to be a skeptic of that idea And I
Mm,
can find plenty of support for my ideas, but I prefer the evidence-driven ways. And there's a lot of tracking that we do within our organization. So maybe there's a way we could use the info we already sort of passively collect to test the idea.
very cool. Awesome. Thank you, Grant. All right. Let's do Ignas. Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes, Ignas.
Ignas, thank
Uh,
you.
so uh, so as part of like developer platform, a lot of interventions that we or changes to the process that we do are uh, there is like the stick or the carrot. So basically, often when you want to make the organization more productive as a whole, you need people to do things that they do not like or do not feel comfortable with because of
Mm,
lack of skills and lack of these kind of things. And the question is around like how do you balance like these things? Because if you go for too much stick, for example, I've worked in teams that valued discipline in engineering very highly. And when you ask some people who consider themselves creatives to be more disciplined, they react adversely to that. And the question is basically how much stick and how much carrot. And like it's very hard to, if you go for too much stick, you get negative results. If
mm,
you don't go for any stick at
okay.
all, you don't get any results.
Got it.
And
All right. Thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm going to cut you off because I
yeah,
know
yeah, yeah. Oh, yes, yes.
I want to point something out, which I'm just keeping tight time management, and I appreciate all of you for being compassionate about it. And the reason is I actually wanted this to show us something, which I think it is, which is that every time you have a research question, it is usually a huge bundle of research questions, right? So this leads to that, leads to that. And the very first step I advise anyone I'm working on a project with to go into is we have to do two things. We have to do what we call unpacking and what we call specifying. Unpacking is when you kind of start to pull open that suitcase of like, what is it that this idea really contains? And for some of us, right, it might contain multiple projects, it might contain multiple questions. And it's really, really easy for our minds to trick us into thinking that we've actually gotten a lot more specific than we have. But these are often the kind of invisible decisions of research design that are there in the beginning of studies. Like, how am I going to try to triangulate this? Which one of these questions is more important to me? In what context am I doing my study, right? So all of that kind of falls for me under unpacking when you are trying to get it clear to yourself, just you. And actually, we have a lot of interesting practices to provide like different externalization and structure for this as scientists. One I really like is pre-registration. But just to give you a few keywords for like your future Googling, I love to talk about specifying your research question more precisely and unpacking. Okay, I know we have other really awesome research ideas here, but I'm going to ask you to put your hands down and we're going to go forward to the next section. All right. All right. And also, one thing you might consider is if you think someone's research idea here is very interesting, have a chat in the comments with each other and follow up after this session. That is completely allowed. Now, I'm going to specify us further down, all right, in this workshop. I actually picked a study idea because I just needed to cohere on something and do a little pre-work before it. And the idea I picked for us to think about is, does greater autonomy connect to more team success? Now, as you think about this, you might think, oh gosh, there's actually some ways in which this study could fit in what I'm interested in, or there are pieces of what I'm interested in that could map on here. And that is awesome. That's part of kind of the big cross dialogue. We never solve anything with one single study, right? We always kind of build bodies of evidence. So your part of the body of evidence might look different than my part of the body of evidence. But together, we're kind of acting like we're one lab right now, and we're going to decide this is our hot topic, our most important one. And I want you to do something that I find a very valuable exercise when I'm at the absolute beginning of a research project. So this is a solo thing for you to do. You have a piece of paper, you can use that, you can use the chat if you don't. You're going to try to design the worst study you can imagine about whether team autonomy leads to team success. You could have a different hypothesis than that. You could say, I think team autonomy degrades team success. I don't care what the relationship is there, but team autonomy and team success, or individual autonomy and team success, we're going to get further into what those mean. Just those two constructs. So you're going to take about 3 minutes. I'm going to give you a good little amount of time, and you can talk about this in the chat as well. And we're going to start now. All right. Okay, we're going to call it for time here. This is amazing, amazing ideas in the chat. So we're going to take a few minutes to go through a couple of these. And let's just come off mic when you want to. But if that is too difficult, I doubt everyone will speak at once, but we can do hands. There we go. And what I'm asking you to do is just tell us about your bad study idea and tell us why you think it's bad.
My study is
When
that I measure success by lines of code.
Awesome. And why is that bad to you?
I don't think I think success is very hard to define, and that is I mean, it doesn't mean outcomes. It just, you get
Okay.
bad code all day.
So maybe like in this study, we have an outcome measure that is not a good outcome measure. It's not actually the outcome we care about, or it will misrepresent the outcome we care about, something like that. Yeah, totally. Awesome. Mark, I saw your hand go at Mark Higgins.
So my initial bad study idea, which is something I do quite a lot, is just start with a survey. So skip the research design thing and just send a survey.
Okay, yeah. All right, how is this survey designed? Is it like in your sleep if you
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, got it. Got it. Just completely skip designing methods. Fantastic. I saw some interesting comments about who we ask. Who do we study with this? Do we study executives, for instance, if we're trying to learn about teams? I'm not sure whose hand went up, but let's say May.
Uh, I want to completely isolate developers to work on projects alone. You put them in a room and you say, okay, here's your task, and that's because that's autonomy, right?
Got it. Okay. So I can hear a few things might be going wrong here. One, bad definition of autonomy. Two, perhaps this is terrible for the people in the study. Is there anything I'm missing that makes this the worst study for this topic?
And I think just the context that would be missing, because that's not
Okay.
how anyone works.
Got it. Okay, so a generalizability problem, probably. It's not accurately representing what we really want this study to be showing us. All right, maybe time for one more. How about Fred for this one?
All right, I decided to pack as much as I could in it. So I picked a single team of 6 developers, 3 of which are given autonomy, 3 of which are not given autonomy. And you seek out which ones make the team most productive, which is not what we're looking for, over the course of 2 or 3 hours.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Let me see. I'm sorry. I'm just taking a beat to think about whether I want to hop us to a different part of my little slideshow. And I think I do, because I think it would be useful. All right. I'm going to do that. So let's talk for a second about the concept of validity. And in validity and what we are measuring is part of what we're learning from surfacing like the worst kind of studies in the world here. And I want to give you like, just because I said, hey, we'll assume no research background here. I want to give you like a little bit of scientific language about this stuff we're talking about. And then we can share that language. So something that we do when we come up with a study design, and differs a little bit as between fields and what we call it. In psychology, we like to pick the least pronounceable terms for everything that we can. So we call it operationalization. And this is just what is the process by which we're going to turn some unmeasurable, big phenomenon in the world into a measurable slice of the world. And I always keep a few things in mind about it. especially because you want to be able to tell the difference between a study that is imperfect because all studies are imperfect and a study that is just bad, one of those worst studies in the world, right? So it's true that every operationalization is basically imperfect. We kind of think this by definition that the unmeasurable, big phenomena out there will always be a little bit beyond how we're trying to boil up a little graspable, testable slice of it. Now, this is not a science philosophy workshop, so we could have a huge debate here about qualitative and quantitative. I am primarily a quantitative methodologist, so I come from a mixed methods background as well. So I respect like the diversity in that, but we're just taking a little bit of like a quantitative frame on this. One of the reasons that I like to take that quantitative frame is because across everything that you've shared, I have heard you want to win arguments with the evidence that you are generating. I have heard that across these very different ideas. And I think all of us seem to me to be motivated to create some positive change. So my way to do that is usually with quantitative evidence. So that's what I'll kind of focus this on, but we can do it with qualitative evidence as well. But just keep that in mind. I'm a little bit speaking from the quantitative science perspective. So when we create a measure, it's always imperfect. It doesn't capture the whole phenomenon, but we do decide this is a testable slice of it. And we need to explicitly acknowledge how we did this. Why did we decide that a survey item to which someone responds is going to operationalize autonomy? That's a set of decisions that we made, and there are trade-offs in all of those decisions. We could operationalize something else. So we could operationalize the number of keystrokes that a developer makes in a day and say, well, if their boss is leaving them alone, then they are more autonomous, and that will show up in their how they use their keyboard. And so we'll take like a raw quantity of typing and we'll decide that's like a higher autonomy day or something like that. You can see that there were many steps that came between autonomy and like keyboard typing. But this is one of those tools for your toolkit that I wanted you to leave this session with. If you just spend a little bit of time thinking, how did this study operationalize? They say they're measuring autonomy. What are the steps it took to get from autonomy to keyboard typing, or hopefully some other better measure? And it's really the responsibility of the researcher to tell you why their measure actually makes sense. And that is something that we usually call validity. So this is a bit from a free open online textbook that I'm going to send you all home with at the end of this workshop that I love. It's called Experimentology. And they say we look for a measure to be valid in the context of a study. And that has to do with whether there's evidence that fits into the broader theory as it relates to the construct it's supposed to be measuring. So for example, if we have a particular survey scale and we say, oh, we think this maps onto autonomy, but some other researcher over here, a developer success lab number 2, say, developed their own measure of autonomy. Do those scales seem to relate? Do they correlate? And this is one way that we start to strengthen our measures over time. It's when many diverse sets of evidence kind of point to measuring the same thing. And then we have resulting from this validity checks inside of a lot of studies. So there's a whole deep, deep area you could dive into. I basically want you to take away the idea that we're always doing operationalization and we need to care a little bit about validity. And a lot of the concerns you're starting to raise feel validity shaped to me. So let's give you like a little bit more of a vocabulary for it. And this is probably familiar to all the experimentalists in the room, but these are the 3 ones I try to introduce to teams, like to software teams, when they're standing up a measurement practice and they've never had one before. So we think about things like face validity, and this is almost like your lowest hanging fruit. Like someone says their survey measures autonomy, but the questions they're all asking are bizarre questions, or you read them and you think, everyone's going to interpret this completely differently. This might be a survey that fails to have face validity. So it's usually about saying we have an intuition that this operationalization is not a very good or reliable match to the construct we're talking about. And it's an important check, but it's a little bit more atheoretical and a little bit more like you'll see a lot of people have just judgment calls, a little bit of that atheoretical, we think this makes sense or we think it doesn't step here. All right. The next two are the ones that I love to bring to teams' attention. So one is the concept of ecological validity. Is the thing that we're measuring actually close to the real world situation that we see people go through? So, like, if we have a laboratory task where we're asking people to come in and we're giving them like a puzzle, and then we're saying there's a more autonomous way to solve this puzzle, or there's a more collaborative way to solve this puzzle. That might be an interesting test, but it also might not be very ecologically valid to autonomy inside of a software team for software developers. So this one is usually the one that if you're not a researcher or a scientist, you have a lot of good intuition about because you're always sort of seeing a study in the news or something and thinking, yeah, but that's not like exactly how this stuff shows up in my life. So the term for this we like is ecological validity. And I also believe that a lot of science has not really cared enough about this. So we've made a lot of scientific mistakes. For instance, we have laboratory tests of executive functioning, so like working memory and attention kind of system and things like that, that have looked a certain way in the lab, but then not translated to the real world context of people. So, for instance, low income children perform worse on these lab-based executive functioning tests. But as people have developed more ecologically valid ways to do these tasks, so they've given them like problems that make sense in their real world, we've actually seen people perform much, much better. So there's a lot of, you'll see me rant about some of these scientific mistakes, but when there's that divergence, it tends to be ecological validity. Now, we also care a lot about internal validity. Internal validity has to do with how much really, I find this one, I'll admit to you, I was kind of struggling to write this definition this morning. It captures like a huge number of other validities, but it essentially says the relationship you're telling me this is evidence about, the evidence is really flawed in some way. So that might be a methodological flaw, like okay, there's an unmeasured confound here. We did an intervention study of code review anxiety, and one possible threat to the evidence that we found in our study was that the person who administered our intervention was a trained clinician. Now, we acknowledged this in our paper, and we always said this effect that we're seeing where this workshop training we developed help people manage their anxiety might depend on having a clinician who is administering this intervention. It might not be there in a different methodological setting. So if someone isn't a trained clinician, we don't know that from this study because we didn't vary those pieces. So that was like an acknowledged threat to the internal validity, and every study has one, but it's important to think about it. All right. I feel like I just dumped a lot of jargon on you, so I'm going to take a beat. Like, are there questions here? Does this give you like a little bit of a framework for some of the concerns we raised? Yeah, go ahead, Rohan.
Roja, yeah. Can you give
Roja.
another example of the third one being violated? I'm not sure if is it, yeah, that would be
Yeah,
great.
totally. I mean, internal validity might also be compromised by something like selection bias. So let's say you have a study and you say, this study is going to tell you about all software developers and their autonomy. And you only recruit the 100 software developers who are working in your building. There might be some really systematic characteristics of those developers. So they may share all your culture, right? They work at your same company. They're in your if that goes unacknowledged, it might be a really big threat to your study. Now, there are many, many studies that say these were our constraints. This was our recruiting. This was what we had, and you should keep it in mind because it's a potential threat to what we're telling you. And that's kind of our judgment to say what we take from that. All right, Ignace, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so uh, just a question. So if I start, for example, from data and look where the data takes me, is that does that usually fall under free? Like when, you take GitHub data set of all the commits that are happening and you start looking at what that might predict, or is that still a valid study?
I'm not sure I'm following. Could you restate that when you said free? I wasn't sure if I heard that correctly.
Uh, so when you follow so for example, some of the studies that people proposed as bad studies, if you
Mm.
would collect that data across a large population of developers, you still, if you wanted to, you still could extract valuable insights out of it. Is that always a bad idea? Is that always under like free, or is that a valid way of conducting like science?
Mm. I think it's a valid way of conducting science, but it's really hard for me to answer this question in general because
Hmm.
it's kind of saying, hey, can we turn a big bad idea? Can we improve on a bad idea? Yes. And you will have to. So every first idea you come up with is not the study you should do, right? And so it will have, I mean, sometimes you might, come up with an incredible study idea, but as I think was it Mark who said, you shouldn't run the survey that you just came up with in your sleep and never thought about, right? It's a big, you're opening yourself up to the risk of it being terrible. But if you're asking, are there components we could change that would suddenly make this, that would counteract like the problems we're identifying? I mean, absolutely. I think with many, many ideas there are. Now, not with all ideas, because sometimes there's just something that is ethically wrong for us to measure, something that is a profound distortion, of what we're trying to measure. But I think I'm hearing this as kind of a really general question of like,
It,
can we look at the weak spots and learn from them? Then I think
so
yes.
it's, sorry, just to clarify. So it's more about imagine when you're in an organization and you don't even have the budget to run a survey. So you look
Mm.
at database of tickets instead, basically.
Oh, I
And
see. I see.
because
Yeah.
that's what's already there.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm hearing this. Okay. I have every time I talk about research design with a tech audience, I'm going off my little workshop script a little bit, but I feel like this is a really important thing. Everybody falls into the pit of despair when you start thinking about threats to validity. Okay. And suddenly nothing feels real and nothing feels possible. And literally every time I try to measure anything, I feel this too. Okay. Every project I ever do, I feel this way. And how do we get through it? I don't think we get through it by pretending we're omniscient. Well, I think some people make that choice and we see what results from it. I think that we start to decide what we care about and what is like an imperfect but good step forward versus like a step backwards for everyone who might encounter our work. So think about, I always go back to medicine because that's like very real in my life. When my mom had to get hip replacement surgery, I read the studies that her actual surgeon published, which was really interesting. And with my research brain, I was like, oh gosh, I would love it if this was a study of every single person who ever had a hip replacement in the whole world. But it's not. I would love it if there was a study that identified someone of exactly my mom's shape and stature, for the surgery outcomes here, but there wasn't. However, there were these really incredible things about this situation and about the evidence I was consuming. My mom's surgeon was a really influential female surgeon who cared a lot about operating on women, for instance. So that was a piece of evidence that she had contributed to the field that let us make a better, stronger decision about the actual choices we made, with her health. And that to me is always the kind of decision I look at and I think, yeah, like science is imperfect, studies are imperfect, but studies are still good. Science is still really amazing. And we can get there. And I really think the way we get there is honesty. So when you say, I wish I could study this some other way, but all I have access to are these data, then I think that you need to take an honest, hard look at what is available and possible with that data. All right, so one way we can do that is by getting clear about methods. Okay. And I'm gonna walk you through like a few little methods, and you can start to maybe map on like what is possible in your space and your constraints to the methods. And usually when we talk about research methods, we kind of have an implicit ranking in our mind of how strong the evidence is from these different methods. So you are allowed to generate evidence that is not as strong as other evidence generated in another way. You are allowed to do that. You are allowed to say, I interviewed 5 people. That's not the same as a million people, but it told me something. You just need to be clear and honest about what it is. Sometimes we have methodological choice. So, assuming that we do, we might want to consider like, I kind of lump these in these 4 areas. We could argue about this, but you might see controlled experiments. So this is like a direct manipulation. We took people, we randomly split them up into 2 groups, and we gave group A the medicine and we gave group B the placebo. Or in the case of the code review anxiety intervention study that I did, we gave one group the intervention, we gave another group not the intervention, and just measured them over time to see if the time effects was the change instead of our intervention. That's a controlled experiment. And a lot of people live in this zone. You know, clinical trials live in this zone. A lot of what you think of as scientists usually lives in this zone. And if you take a research methods class, you probably live in this zone. But unfortunately, our zones in industry are usually the other zones where you don't get as much love and attention. So an area I've spent a lot of time is natural experiments. Can you look at an existing data set or an existing set of events in the world and say, well, okay, I can't directly manipulate this. I can't randomly assign people to things. It would be unethical to do so, for instance, or just impossible. But maybe I can find a way where the natural variation in the world can work in my favor. So this is how we tend to study stuff like big health outcomes at scale. I've also done this with engineering organizations. It does take a lot of statistical expertise and thinking here, but it's possible, especially at the scale of software data. Now, you are limited to what the measurable events are, and there's a whole lot of constraint there, but you might get access to scale. There's observational studies, and this is a pretty important distinction to make that I think a lot of people don't get 100% clear on in our worlds. If you, for instance, do a survey about developer experience, that's usually just an observational study. There might be confounds or unmeasured correlations in there, but they're also profoundly, profoundly useful, right? Like in order to understand what we want to even graduate to the level of a controlled experiment, we usually need a lot of descriptive work. Or maybe to challenge what we have studied in those more expensive controlled experiments. If it's often a lot cheaper and more accessible to kind of do observational studies. We might surface a lot of hypotheses that we actually have not yet tested, and kind of reset that narrative. And finally, as I mentioned before, there's qualitative methods. There's a lot that we can do with that. All right. I want to give us like a little bit of interactive moment. I knew this was going to happen, but I've like got so much more content than we had time for today. Let's take a moment to say, what do we feel like might be the best methodological choice for our research question? Team autonomy to team success. And you could ground this in your real life. Like if you were really going to do this study, what method might you choose?
So one of the things I've been thinking about is how would we as individuals working in organizations do something like this, right? Because when we're thinking about these research problems, half the time it's almost always in the context of where we work.
Yeah.
So I think if you look at it from that context and you want to, and you're doing something and you want to document that change in a way, would it
Mm.
be an observational study or descriptive?
Yeah, people always want to match a method onto like in this way, like and I actually think the real reality is you could do multiple methods. Like you could be in a situation at a company where all you can do is observational. All you can do is run surveys. Or you might be in the position to actually make a decision about rolling out a tool that you randomly select teams to get, and you're in the area of more controlled experimentation. Some companies I've worked with even have, somewhat of a lab situation where they might bring somebody into like their L&D org, give them a training, see what the results of that training were, compare it to a different one, like a little bit more of an applied controlled experiment. So lots and lots of things are possible. And I'm interested in kind of just what do we think might be the best or the most exciting or maybe the most unique value contributed by a type of method for this question. And I will say too, I think we need all methods. Like we need a diversity of evidence in order to fill out our picture of the world. All right, I see some hands up and let me view the hands here. This is like a Zoom training session for me, so thank you for that. Jennifer, has you have your hand up and I don't think you've gotten to speak.
Yeah, so I guess I was going to say that like for this survey or this study that we're designing, that I would want to understand the environment better before I could even like begin to design methods for it. So, I would want to
Hmm.
conduct some analysis on like what teams do we have and like how
Cool.
much like what's the range of autonomy they have and what's the range of successes that they have and how are we defining those things and
Hmm. I love that. I
then
love that.
yeah.
So, some ideas that come, I love that, and that is frequently part of my research design process. Before we have ever narrowed down on a construct, like one thing you can do is look at other research in this area. If you have a psychological question, I guarantee you are not the first person who's had it. And that is often where we can take some triangulation from other bodies of research. And I recognize it's a skill to do this. It's like a trained skill that I spent many years learning to do. So it's not like necessarily easy. But it is really helpful to not have to start from scratch on saying in lots of other environments or lots of other areas, these have been like four big things that matter. And so I want to try to like see how that exists in my environment. You can also do audits, like I've worked with a number of software teams to just do an audit of like, how is it that people in this org would describe their problems? Do they kind of seem to cohere on these themes? Now, I will caution that I see people do this badly, like a lot of the time, and it ends up being kind of like my 50 friends and the 50 and the five things they complain about, rather than like a systematic audit. So you want to be kind of careful how you do that. All right. Grant, you have your hand up. You want to speak to this?
Yeah, I guess no, the natural scientist in me wants to deviate toward, or not deviate, but go toward a controlled experiment in all the cases where I can. But I think for the purposes of a study of I were doing it today, a natural experiment would be the easiest one just because of the amount of data within my org that we're kind of gathering. I also wonder, and maybe you can speak to this, Pat, how worrisome it is when you're doing a study, a controlled, trying to do a controlled study on software developers, particularly, and whether they uh, how opinionated they can be makes a difference to whether they like stay within the constraints of whatever the experiment is that you're trying to run. That'll be my worry about like doing a fully
Yeah.
controlled one.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of art to designing a study that people understand and have buy-in for and aren't violating. And
Mhm.
that's actually something that I poured, I mean, God, probably like more than any other single area is what I cared about for the design of my studies. So yeah, different workshop on that. But I would say like the participant buy-in and like making sure you're doing research
Mhm.
with people and not just like on people is super important. And I especially
Right.
with a group that's been like put under the microscope too much. Oh, my camera battery just died, so hang on a second, folks. Let me start my other camera. Yeah, a group that's been like put under the microscope um as software developers is going to be like so highly sensitive to, you know, feeling like they're being tricked by a study or feeling like somebody's out to get them with a study. And so one
Or
of
to
the
be
biggest,
scrutinized, yeah.
yeah, you guys will see this in my book when it comes out. One of the biggest things I spend the chapter on evidence that I wrote, I talk a lot about making sure that people feel that they benefit from what you're doing. And so, we spent a large part of this little time together talking about what are we trying to get out of this study and what are we going to use this study for? And I think that that's going to really help bring some clarity to like how we design the studies. Clearly, we
Mm.
maybe need to have like a second office hour to just get through like more interesting topics here. I want to kind of share with you like one, I think this is a little bit helpful. When you're in this land of research design, you can kind of divide your challenges up into like three things. All right. You can push forward on a topic, you can push forward on a method, and you can also push forward on a population. So a group of people, that haven't really been talked to before. And I always advise, like the young scientists I've worked with, it is really hard to do something totally novel and untested in all of these areas. And you should, if you're going to try to design a project where you really push forward on one of these frontiers, try to set yourself up to have like some rigorous grounding from other people or other work in the other areas. So, for instance, you have a topic that you think is like pretty novel, try to lean on methods that are well tested, well understood, use people's playbooks. Or you're working out into a new population. Maybe don't invent completely new measures at the same time as you're trying to work with a brand new population. And these are just some tips that, my teams have kind of taken this approach over the years. Um, okay, folks, I want to like wind us down because this has been like so much fun and a little bit chaotic, and I want to leave you with like more resources for learning more because I know we didn't get through everything. I'm going to share these slides with you, but meanwhile, you can keep learning about research design at a number of free resources. So this textbook that I recommended, experimentology.io, this is an awesome, awesome resource for just like looking at those jargon terms, reminding yourself what the definition of some validity is. I also have put up some statistics resources here. So one on causal inference, the causal inference mixtape, and then the statistical rethinking courses and book are pretty phenomenal. I've also linked Calling Bullshit is a really fun book about how we evaluate evidence, and there's kind of a lot of online resources. I think a whole course about that, and I'll link you out to a few other pieces of writing I found helpful. And you can find me many places. I have a book coming out in 2026 that covers a lot of the ideas here. You can subscribe to my newsletter where I will host this workshop. I'm going to stop kind of like the content of this moment now and say thank you so much for coming, for your lively comments. Take a moment to maybe like download the chat because this chat was wonderful. And would anybody be interested in a second office hour about research design so we can go a little deeper into actually building the study for autonomy and success? I see some nods. Okay. All right.